are going, we don't need roads.
Hello and welcome to the first of this year's Heritage Open Day videos. This year is the 250th anniversary of the opening of Preston Brook Tunnel, so we'll look at its story, from its beginning as a porthole to the future, to its present as a passage to the past. February the 18th, 1775. A broad bluff boat is making her way through the darkness. Two men lie on their backs, sidestepping against the tunnel wall, pushing the boat forwards with each step. The boat is carrying some 40-odd tons of coal, and when she emerges back into the daylight, she is reattached to her horse and proceeds along the Trent and Mersey Canal to Bartington Wharf. No particular fanfare accompanies this trip. There are no brass bands or budding poets to mark the occasion like there will be at Crick some 70 years later. This is the first of the major canal tunnels. This is the beginning. Preston Brook Tunnel is the official threshold between the Bridgewater and the Trent and Mersey canals. Its construction was needed to complete the circuit, allowing waterways communication between Hull and Liverpool, and ultimately then to connect Bristol and London as part of the big Grand Cross plan. Preston Brook Tunnel, of course, has its siblings. Barnton and Saltersford are the closest geographically, while Harecastle is the younger twin, as it was constructed simultaneously. The line of the tunnel was marked out by James Brindley around April 1769. He stayed in Preston Brook at the Royal Oak, a smallish farm inn run by an interesting, if slightly promiscuous chap called Daniel Usherwood. The Oak was the only inn in the village, and it was regularly frequented by Brindley, as well as other famous, and unknown, canalmen. While Brindley marked out the line, and quite probably was there when the first shovels went in, the construction of Preston Brook was left to the idiosyncratic Charles Jones. There is very little known about Charles Jones before he appears at Preston Brook, with the first confirmed record of him being 3 years after the construction had actually started. 15th of July 1773. Ordered that this meeting be adjourned to such a day as Mr. Lax shall appoint, and that so soon as he shall have appointed the said meeting, he do immediately write to Mr. Charles Jones at Preston on the Hill near Warrington to desire attendance at the said meeting, and that he give an account of the tunnel under his care, and that if he does not attend and give such account, his son will be discharged from the service of the said proprietors. These are the minutes of the Chesterfield Canal Company. The Chesterfield Canal was in the process of constructing Norwood Tunnel, and evidently it wasn't going well for Charles Jr. Charles Sr. must have turned up and said something right, as his son was allowed to keep his job, although this was a decision the company appeared to regret, as just 6 months later the minutes note that the work is unfinished and running over budget. To build a canal at this time required skill, grit, and a small army of men. These men weren't the poorly paid navvies we imagine today, and they would have been rather confused if you had called them that. They generally called themselves canal cutters, and they were fought over bitterly by companies vying for a good workforce. Digging a tunnel was even more of a specialist job. A good proportion of the tunnel men, Charles Jones included, came from a mining background, and the resident population generally considered them still to be miners as they burrowed deep under the earth in pursuit of the canal. This thought process remained unchanged long after Preston Brook was completed, with a sudden influx of miners in the Crick parish registers during the construction of its tunnel in 1814. Brickmakers and setters also made up a large part of the team, with the Preston Brook Tunnel needing some 4 million bricks by its completion. These were made locally, in a field believed to have been where the Stafford warehouse now sits. Although the land went from peaceful arable to smoky industry, the landholders did rather well out of it, as can be seen here with Samuel Hockenhull's payment from the Duke of Bridgewater when he took over the brickworks after the tunnel was finished. Brickmaking was a laborious process that the whole family could get involved with, and while none of the payment books for the Trent and Mersey Company survive, there's no reason to believe that women weren't heaving barrows about at Preston Brook. The process begins with clay, dug straight out of the ground. Although here clay did end up being shipped when the canal was open, because they ran out of natural deposits. Firstly, big stones were picked out of the clay, and then it was brought to the pug mill, a machine rather like a big food mixer, to be made into the right consistency for the brickmakers to work with. A large bunch of clay was taken and worked roughly by hand, and then thrown hard into the wooden mould so clay filled every corner. Then it was pressed and smoothed down before the surplus was sliced off. A useful assistant would then take the clay-filled mould away and tip the wet brick out to dry for about a week before it would be stacked with thousands of others in a clump, ready to be fired to a high temperature to become a solid brick. While the local labourers hired in to swell the ranks could go home of an evening, the influx to the village created a bit of a housing shortage. Camaraderie among the workforce was quite high, and an unwritten code of conduct came into being in many instances, wherein men with families got first dibs on the local renting rooms, while the rest made do with what they could. In some instances, like Husbands Bosworth in Northamptonshire, long wooden dormitory huts were created as close to the worksite as possible. It's believed that there was at least one of these huts built at Preston Brook, somewhere in the field behind the wharf. Until just a few months ago you could see many marks of the canal story in the field, from the hollows where clay and marl were excavated to the faint scars of paths and buildings, and even vast quantities of broken pottery from hidden rubbish pits. All this has sadly been lost under a new development, and it was not investigated beforehand, so now we will never know what stories the field could have told us. Make no mistake, digging the tunnel was hard, dangerous work. The company records for the Trent and Mersey have been lost, so we have to rely on contemporary accounts to fill in some of the gaps. We know that the Duke of Bridgewater's men, including colliers, canal builders, the wharfingers, the Gilberts, and the Duke of Bridgewater's own butler, contributed to a sick and hurt club at the rate of 2 shillings a quarter. With no hospitals close by, someone would have been dispatched to find a medical man and bring him back to the patient. There were some reasonably respected doctors and surgeons in nearby Runcorn, Warrington, Northwich and Frodsham at the time, and there was also one in Walton working in the 1750s, although it's unclear if he was still practising when they were building the tunnel. But men did die. We don't have a definitive list of the men from the tunnel, but these brothers, buried together in Daresbury churchyard, are almost certainly 2 who gave their lives to its construction. Fights invariably happened. There is a legend that in one early tunnel, perhaps Preston Brook itself, that a fight over a man's wife resulted in the death of the woman and her assailant, and to prevent the construction being delayed they hid her body deep in the tunnel and pulled the roof down over the man to make it look like his death was an accident. While such legends may seem fanciful, they do say that behind every tall tale is a grain of truth, so I leave you to your own conclusions. Preston Brook's construction plodded on without much incident until some time after Brinley's death in 1772. It had originally been expected that at the very least Preston Brook Tunnel would be completed by then, but in fact it was only just approaching the halfway mark. Charles Jones appears to have been a competent enough engineer, but either didn't have the confidence to work independent of instruction, or was under strict orders to follow a set plan. Either way, the net result was that the tunnel started to go squonk. Shafts didn't meet up properly, and even worse was yet to come when someone with a tape measure pointed out that the tunnel wasn't wide enough for the Duke's big barges to get through. There is an apocryphal story that this wasn't actually discovered with a tape measure at all, but in person. So the story goes, they had passed the halfway mark and filled it with water with the intention of floating the bricks in on a barge rather than having to manhandle them. There was supposed to be a suitable inspection by the people with a vested interest, the Duke included, so they fitted up the cleanest of his barges and entered the tunnel ready to view this fantastic new engineering marvel and have a lovely day out. And as they got to the work site deep underground, the boat came to a grinding halt that required the combined efforts of visitors and workmen alike to free her and get her back out. However the problems were discovered, there was a frantic and slightly desperate bid to remedy them that apparently caused more harm than good, with everyone getting so fed up that in the end the Duke of Bridgewater himself sent one of his own engineers, a gang of men, and his rather abused cheque-book to the site with the instructions to get it done. And get it done they did, although despite best efforts they couldn't widen it enough, and it ended up at 13 feet 9 at its best, still too narrow. With the tunnel now open, the Trent and Mersey teams departed southward to repeat the tunnel process with Barnton and Saltersford, but it appears that Charles Jones did not go with them. Ever enigmatic, Jones is difficult to track after the tunnel, but it appears he stayed and became the first landlord of Thomas Brock's new pub, the Red Lion. His story seems to go rather sadly. After burying his son, he departs Preston Brook and is next seen in 1783 at the construction for Sapperton Tunnel, where he's now a functional alcoholic with significant debts. Thomas Brock, the landowner for Preston Brook, was well aware of what the canal would bring and had begun an intense rebuilding scheme to the village. The excess bricks from the tunnel itself went into building a warehouse that he promptly leased out to the Trent and Mersey Company. As well as the new pub, he also built a windmill at the top of the hill overlooking the wharf, and he had many of the old cottages pulled down and rebuilt. This is the mill from Runcorn, but the one at Preston Brook would have looked much the same. As we said earlier, the Duke of Bridgewater took on the lease for the brickyard and carried on producing bricks at a great rate, giving priority to the building of his own warehouses before selling on the surplus, probably to Brock. And here we'll end today's video, but I hope you'll join me again for the next part of the tunnel story, when we'll travel 100 years from the days of legging right through to the days of steam.